All right, so let's look at some triangle congruence theorems. So in this lesson, we're going to discuss the side, 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 angle, side, angle, side, angle, and angle, angle, side theorems. And we have the acronyms there below. Okay, so we have our theorems here. The first one is side, side, side. And that's basically, you have three pair of congruent sides. And so if we look here, we can say that these two sides would be congruent along with these two sides. And at the bottom, we have those pair of congruent sides. So three congruent sides. Next, we have side, angle, side. That is two sides and an included angle. So we could have a side, so this would be a congruent side, an included angle right here, and then another side. Included angle meaning that the angle has to be in between the two congruent sides. All right, next we have angle, side, angle. So it's kind of the reverse of side, angle, side. You have two angles and one included side. So right here, angle, we could say that these are congruent. Side, we could say that these two sides are congruent. And angle, we can say that these two angles are congruent. So notice I'm putting two congruent marks for these two congruent angles to denote which angle pairs would be congruent. And last, we have angle, angle side. And that means adjacent congruent angles and one congruent side. So adjacent meaning right next to each other. So we could say our first pair of congruent angles would be right here. Then another pair of congruent angles would be here. And our side would be here. So non-included side. So those are our four congruence theorems that we're going to discuss in this lesson. All right, so now we're going to look at what theorem will prove the following triangles congruent. Which four theorems? Side, 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 angle, side, angle, or angle, angle, side. So let's take a look at our first one. How are we congruent? And so if we notice here, we have congruent angles right here. We have a side that is congruent because they share a side. So we can say that that is the reflexive property because they share a side, so they have to be congruent. And then we have another pair of congruent angles here. So we have an angle, a side, and angle. So of course, that would have to be angle, side, angle. Next, how are these two triangles congruent? Well, again, we can see that they share a side right here. So that's a side. They have an angle here that are congruent. It's an angle and then another side. So we could say that this is, of course, side, angle, side. Okay, so what about these triangles here? Well, we have congruent sides, all right, and then we have congruent angles. But do we see any other congruent sides or congruent angles? Well, right here, we could say that these two angles are congruent because they are vertical angles. And remember, vertical angles are where each pair of opposite angles, they're made by two intersecting lines. And so we have our intersecting lines right here. They're opposite angles made by two intersecting lines, and vertical angles are congruent. So we have a pair of congruent angles here. So we could say that this is angle, angle, side. Okay, so we have these two triangles here. Now for our next three examples, we're not only going to see what theorems match the triangles as far as what makes them congruent, but we're going to write congruency statements for them. And basically a congruent statement is a statement that matches all corresponding sides and angles. So we can look at this as two separate triangles. This would be a triangle LKM, and this would be a triangle JMK, and then we piece it back together and make one figure. So if we look here, we have congruent sides. Sides JM and LK are congruent. And then we have these congruent angles. So angle JMK and LKM are congruent. And then we also have this side here, the side that they share that is at the bottom, side MK. They share this side, so that is a congruent side as well. And so of course these two triangles will be congruent by side, angle, side. So our congruency statement would be triangle JMK is congruent to triangle LKM. And if we notice here, side JM and LK are congruent. Side MK and KM are congruent because that's the side that they share. And side JK and LM are congruent. And also we can look at angle M or JKM, or JMK right here. Alright, and angle LKM that are congruent. So we can see how our corresponding sides and angles match with our congruent statement. So looking at this figure here, we can see that sides CE and ED are congruent, as well as sides CF and DF are congruent, and then they share this third side here. So it would have to be congruent. EF is congruent to EF. So these triangles have three congruent sides. So of course this would be side, side, side. A congruent statement that we could write would be triangle ECF is congruent to triangle EDF, because as we can see, EC and ED are congruent, CF and DF are congruent, and EF is congruent to, of course, EF. We can actually write a different congruent statement. So as long as our corresponding sides and angles match, I could actually flip this and write this as triangle FCE is congruent to triangle FDE. So as we see here, side FC is congruent to side DF for FD. Side CE, of course, is congruent to side DE. And then, of course, FE is congruent to FE. So with our congruency statements, as long as the corresponding sides match, we can write our congruency statement. Let's take a look at this figure here. So we have the two triangles, but if we notice, we have parallel sides here. So sides ME, or side ME, is parallel to side DJ. So since those two sides are parallel, we can conclude that DE is actually a transversal. So since DE is a transversal and DJ and ME are parallel sides, we can conclude that angle D right here, or angle JDE, and angle E or angle MED are congruent because they are alternate interior angles. Abbreviating here. So let's see what theorem matches to show that these two triangles are congruent. So we have congruent side here. Okay. And then we have congruent angles right here. And we also have congruent sides. So we could say that these two triangles are congruent by side, angle, side. However, if we look a little closer, we could see that we have vertical angles right here. So we have these intersecting lines. So these two angles are congruent. And so we have angle, side, angle as well. So we can actually use two of these theorems to show that these triangles are congruent, side, and angle, side, angle. Alright, so we're at our last example here. So we can see that we have congruent sides, right? So congruent sides. And then we have these pair of congruent sides because they share a side, so they have to be congruent. But then we have congruent angles. Alright, so we have side, side, angle. Is that one of our theorems? No, that is not. There is no side, side, angle. So we can conclude that these two triangles are not even congruent for this last one here. Alright, so we've discussed 4 of our theorems for proving triangle congruency. Hopefully you understood the lesson, and that was our last example. Alright, so our related videos are congruent triangles and the HL theorem. If you enjoyed this lesson, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Peach Pie. Thank you for learning with me.